Section 1. The rain drummed against the glass windows of Daniel Gray's penthouse, a rhythmic tapping that did nothing to settle the storm brewing inside. The sleek modern space, usually pristine, felt oddly empty tonight, despite the dim glow of the chandelier casting long shadows across the marble floors. It wasn't the absence of company that made the air feel so suffocating. It was the woman standing in front of him, her expression unreadable, her shoulders squared as if she were bracing for a war she'd already won in her heart. Claire. She looked the same as the last time he'd seen her, at least physically. Her soft brown hair framed her face, her green eyes sharp and steady despite the tension in the air. But there was something else there, something different, a quiet finality, a strength he hadn't seen in her before, at least not directed at him. Daniel exhaled slowly, adjusting the cufflinks of his tailored suit. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice calm, practiced. It was the same tone he used in business meetings, the same tone that had closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. "If this is about the past," Claire's lips pressed together in a thin line before she dropped the stack of papers onto the coffee table between them. The weight of them echoed in the silence. "It's not about the past," she said. "It's about the future. My future." He scoffed, reaching for the documents. He flipped through them lazily, as if she had handed him a trivial contract rather than a divorce settlement. His name, printed neatly alongside hers, was scattered across the pages like a brand he hadn't realized could be stripped away so easily. "You're serious." His voice held a hint of amusement, disbelief curling around the edges. "You actually want to go through with this?" Claire didn't waver. "I already have." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. This was absurd. Claire had been the one who had stood by him, through every late night, every ruthless decision, every moment when his work had consumed him whole. She had been the one to smile through it all, to remind him that there was more to life than boardrooms and balance sheets. And now, she was walking away. No. He tossed the papers back onto the table with a smirk. "This is just a game. You're trying to get a reaction out of me." Claire inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "You always do this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "You always think everything is about you." Daniel frowned, the humor draining from his expression. "Claire, what the hell are you talking about?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she turned, walking past him toward the hallway. He watched her go, his brows furrowing as confusion prickled at his spine. Something wasn't right. She was too calm, too resolute. And then, he saw it. The door to what had once been a guest room stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of soft colors, a pale blue wall, a rocking chair in the corner, and in the center of it all, a crib. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He took a step forward before he even realized what he was doing. His pulse hammered in his ears as he pushed the door open, his gaze sweeping across the room. It was small but carefully arranged. A few stuffed animals lined the shelves. A mobile of tiny silver stars hung above the crib, and a soft white blanket was draped over the railing. It was a nursery. His nursery. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. Slowly, he turned back to Claire, who stood in the doorway now, watching him with a mixture of defiance and sadness. "When?" His voice came out lower than he intended, rough around the edges. Claire didn't blink. 2 years ago. The world tilted slightly. His grip on reality slipped just for a second. 2 years? That wasn't possible. That meant... He took a step toward her, his chest tightening. "You were pregnant when you left." "Yes." Daniel's hands trembled, though he quickly shoved them into his pockets, masking the telltale sign of emotion threatening to break through his carefully constructed exterior. His mind reeled, flashes of the past 2 years colliding all at once, the countless times he'd drowned himself in work, the nights he'd spent alone, unaware that somewhere out there, Claire had been carrying his child. His child. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Where is..." He stopped himself, the weight of the question crushing him. "Where is my son?" Claire exhaled through her nose as if preparing herself for this moment. "Asleep. He's in his room." Something inside Daniel cracked. A chasm opened up in his chest, wide and unbearable. He had a son he had never met, a son who had spent his first 2 years of life without knowing his father. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "Why didn't you tell me?" Claire's lips parted, then closed again. She hesitated, But when she spoke, her words were steady. Because you wouldn't have cared. The accusation hit him harder than he expected. Daniel's entire world revolved around control. He dictated every aspect of his life, ensuring that nothing happened without his permission, without his influence. Yet here, in the space of 5 minutes, he had lost everything. His marriage, his sense of reality, and the last 2 years of his son's life. His chest rose and fell in measured breaths as he tried to process it. That's not true. Claire let out a small, humorless laugh. Isn't it? He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her that of course he would have cared, that he would have done something, that he would have never let her go if he had known. But he couldn't, because the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, was that Claire had been right to leave. He had been too wrapped up in his own world, too consumed by his career, to notice the fractures forming in his marriage. And by the time she had walked away, he had been too arrogant to believe she would actually stay gone. Now here he was, standing in a nursery that had existed without him, with a son he had never held, and a wife who was already halfway out the door. A strange sort of numbness settled over him, masking the emotions raging beneath the surface. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Gray had no idea what to do. Claire turned to leave, but before she could step through the doorway, he spoke. I want to see him. She stilled. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then finally, she turned back to him, her green eyes guarded. Why? She asked softly. The answer should have been simple. Because he was his son. Because he had a right to be in his life. Because he refused to let Claire walk away with the last piece of him that still mattered. But none of those reasons would be enough for her. So instead, he said the only thing that really mattered. Because I should have been there. A flicker of something crossed her face. Surprise, uncertainty, hope. But she didn't answer him right away. Instead, she exhaled, glanced toward the nursery, then back at him. I don't know if I can trust you, she admitted. Daniel's jaw tightened. Then let me prove that you can. It was a promise, one he wasn't sure he knew how to keep, but he would, no matter what it took. Section 2. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and old wounds that had never truly healed. Claire stood frozen in the doorway of the nursery, her fingers curled against the frame as if she needed something to hold on to. Daniel, still reeling from the realization that he had a son, a child he had never even known existed, felt the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing down on his chest. He should have seen this coming. No, that wasn't right. He should have been there, for Claire, for their son, for the life that had been growing inside her while he was too blind to see what was slipping away. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. Losing control now wouldn't help anything. He had spent years perfecting the art of calculated decision-making, of keeping his emotions locked away where no one could reach them. It had made him untouchable in business, unstoppable in negotiations. But here, in this moment, he was powerless. Claire was watching him, waiting. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else beneath it, a flicker of uncertainty. She wanted to believe him, but she didn't. Not yet, and he couldn't blame her. I don't expect you to trust me overnight, Daniel said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of arrogance dulled by something more vulnerable. I know I've given you every reason not to. Claire's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Daniel took a careful step toward her, his gaze never leaving hers. But let me see him, Claire. Just for a moment. She hesitated. He could see the battle waging inside her, the instinct to protect their son, the fear that letting Daniel in would only lead to more pain. Then finally, she nodded. Follow me, she said softly. Daniel's breath left him in a quiet exhale of relief, but he didn't let himself celebrate just yet. This was just the beginning. He followed her down the hall, his footsteps light against the hardwood floor. The house was smaller than the penthouse they had once shared, but it felt warm, lived in. There were signs of life everywhere. Family photos on the walls, a few toys scattered near the couch, a small pile of books on the coffee table. Daniel had never noticed how empty his own home felt until now. Claire stopped in front of a door, her fingers tightening around the handle. She glanced at him once more as if giving him a final chance to change his mind. He didn't. She pushed the door open. Daniel stepped inside and felt his heart stop. The room was bathed in soft, golden light from the nightlight plugged into the wall. A tiny bed sat against one corner, covered in a blanket decorated with little blue stars, and curled up beneath it, breathing softly in his sleep, was the child Daniel never knew he had, his son. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The boy, his boy, had Claire's warm brown hair, tousled and messy from sleep. His tiny hand clutched a stuffed bear, the same way Daniel used to hold on to his own as a child. Something inside him cracked. He should have been here, for the first step, the first laugh, the first everything, and he had missed it all. His chest felt tight as he swallowed back the lump in his throat. He had walked into countless boardrooms, stared down ruthless competitors, and closed deals that had made men twice his age fold under pressure. But this was the first time in his life he felt truly, utterly terrified. "He looks just like you when he's mad," Claire whispered, breaking the silence. "Gets this little crease between his eyebrows, just like you do." Daniel let out a soft, disbelieving laugh, his throat thick with emotion. He hadn't realized she'd been watching him this whole time. He tore his gaze away from the boy and looked at Claire instead. "What's his name?" Her lips parted slightly in surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to ask. "Liam?" she said after a moment. "His name is Liam." Liam? Daniel let the name settle in his chest, memorizing it, letting it carve itself into the pieces of him that had been missing for so long. Liam Gray. His son. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, unable to look away. Claire exhaled softly, but there was no relief in it, only exhaustion. "You don't get to come back and just say things like that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't get to show up now and pretend that this is normal." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm not pretending, Claire." She turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. "Then what are you doing?" He didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, maybe he just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I don't want to walk away from him, from you." Claire let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You already did." The words cut deeper than he expected. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "A terrible one, and I will never forgive myself for that. But I need to fix it." Claire stared at him, her expression unreadable. "And how do you plan on doing that?" Daniel swallowed hard. "By being here." Claire shook her head. "It's not that simple." "I know." He hesitated. "But give me a chance, just one." She sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. For the first time since she walked into his penthouse, she looked tired. Not just physically, but emotionally. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel clenched his jaw. "Then let me prove to you that you can." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at Liam, still fast asleep, unaware of the battle waging just beyond his bedroom door. When she finally looked back at Daniel, her eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite place. A flicker of hope, a flicker of doubt, but also something else. Something that told him this wasn't over. Not yet. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. Hope. Section 3. The quiet of Liam's bedroom lingered long after Claire had closed the door behind them, leaving Daniel standing in the hallway, staring at the floor as if the weight of his own mistakes had just settled onto his shoulders. The reality of what he had lost, what he had thrown away, pressed down on him with a force that nearly knocked the air from his lungs. A son, a family, a life he never even knew he wanted until now. He turned to Claire, who was watching him with guarded eyes, arms crossed over her chest as if bracing herself for whatever came next. "I need to be in his life, Claire," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured. "I don't care what it takes." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "You don't get to decide that, Daniel. You don't just show up and claim a role you abandoned years ago." His jaw clenched. "I didn't abandon you." Claire let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't?" She took a step closer, her voice rising slightly. "You pushed me away for months, Daniel. You shut me out of your life, buried yourself in work, and made it impossible for me to stay." He knew she was right. He had spent years telling himself a different story, one where she had walked away too easily, where she hadn't fought for them hard enough. But standing here, with Liam asleep in the next room, he could see it clearly for the first time. He had been the one who left. Not physically, but emotionally. And Claire? She had done the only thing she could to protect herself and their child. "I wasn't ready," Daniel admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Back then He broke off, raking a hand through his hair. "I thought I was protecting you." Claire's expression didn't change. Protecting me? She repeated, her voice quiet but filled with disbelief. From what? From me, Daniel said, the confession raw and unfiltered. Claire's breath hitched slightly, but she recovered quickly. She had built walls around herself, he realized, and he had no right to be surprised by that. She had learned to live without him. She had raised their son alone, and yet she hadn't told him. There had to be a reason. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Why didn't you tell me, Claire?" he asked. "Why didn't you call?" She hesitated, and for the first time since he walked into this house, he saw something flicker across her face. Guilt. "I wanted to," she admitted. "I almost did. So many times. But then I'd remember how things were before I left. How distant you were. How cold. And I convinced myself that you didn't want this. That you wouldn't care." The words stung, but Daniel didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew that at the time, she might have been right. "I would have cared," he said after a long moment. "I do care." Claire studied him for a moment before looking away. "It's too late, Daniel." "No," he said firmly, "it's not." She shook her head, clearly frustrated. "You can't just undo years of absence with a few words." "I know that." He took a step closer, his voice dropping lower. "But I'm here now, Claire, and I'm not going anywhere." Silence stretched between them, thick and unyielding. Finally, Claire sighed, rubbing at her temples as if trying to ease the tension coiling in her body. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" she asked, exhaustion in her voice. He could have said a million things. He could have asked for time, for a second chance, for the impossible. But he knew this wasn't about him. Not anymore. "I just want to be his father," Daniel said simply. "Whatever that looks like." Claire exhaled slowly, looking away. "Liam doesn't know who you are." "I know. And I won't let you come in and out of his life as you please," she warned, her voice firm. Daniel met her gaze head on. "I won't." She studied him for a long time, as if trying to decide whether she believed him. Finally, she nodded, just once. "You can see him," she said, "but on my terms." Daniel exhaled, relief washing through him. He wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was a start. And for the first time in years, Daniel Gray had something to fight for. Section 4. The next morning, Daniel woke before the sun rose, his mind still tangled in the events of the night before. He had barely slept, too wired from the conversation with Claire, too aware of how much his life had shifted in a matter of hours. Sitting in his hotel suite, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on the table in front of him, he let reality sink in. He had a son. A child who had spent 4 years growing up without him, learning to walk, to talk, to laugh, without his father there to witness a single moment of it. It wasn't just regret that gnawed at his insides. It was something sharper. Loss. How many bedtime stories had he missed? How many scraped knees had Claire bandaged without him? He had built an empire, amassed more wealth than most people could dream of, yet he had lost the one thing he couldn't buy back: time. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting him from his thoughts. He picked it up, half expecting it to be his assistant, but his heart nearly stopped when he saw the name on the screen. Claire. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Claire? Be at the park on Oakwood Avenue at 10, she said, skipping any pleasantries. "Liam and I will be there." Then, before he could respond, the call ended. Daniel stared at the phone for a long moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test, and he wouldn't fail it. At exactly 10 o'clock, Daniel stood at the entrance of the park, scanning the area. The morning air was crisp, sunlight filtering through the tall oak trees that lined the walking path. Families were scattered across the grass, kids laughing as they ran toward the playground, their parents chatting from nearby benches. And then he saw them. Claire stood near a wooden picnic table, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She wore a thick sweater and jeans, looking effortlessly beautiful in a way that made something tighten in his chest. And next to her, gripping her hand, was Liam. Daniel's breath caught. He had seen pictures the night before, had spent hours memorizing every detail of the son he had never met. But seeing Liam in person was different. The boy was smaller than he had expected, with messy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. His features were a mix of both of them, Claire's expressive eyes, Daniel's sharp jawline. But it wasn't just how he looked that got to Daniel. It was the way he moved, the energy in his small frame, the way he clung to his mother's hand as if she was his whole world. Because she was. Daniel had no part in that, not yet. Claire spotted him first. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, before gently kneeling beside Liam. "There's someone I want you to meet, sweetheart," she said softly. Liam turned, his big, curious eyes landing on Daniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Claire gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "This is Daniel," she continued. "Remember how I told you about him?" Liam hesitated, fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "You said he was—" He trailed off, his voice quiet. Claire smiled encouragingly. "Go on. You said he was my daddy." Daniel felt his chest tighten painfully. Hearing it out loud, those words, that small voice, hit him harder than he could have prepared for. He took a slow step forward, crouching slightly to be at eye level. "That's right," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I'm your dad." Liam stared at him, expression thoughtful. "You don't look like a dad." Daniel let out a short, surprised chuckle. "Oh yeah. What do dads look like?" Liam shrugged. "Uncle Matt says dads wear funny sweaters and tell bad jokes." Claire laughed under her breath, shaking her head. "Uncle Matt is my brother," she explained. Daniel's lips twitched. "Good to know." There was a pause before Liam spoke again. "You don't wear funny sweaters." Daniel glanced down at his tailored suit. "No, I guess I don't." "Do you tell bad jokes?" Daniel considered this for a moment before nodding. "Probably. Want to hear one?" Liam hesitated, but then nodded cautiously. Daniel thought for a moment before saying, "Why did the Scarecrow win an award?" Liam tilted his head. "Why?" "Because he was outstanding in his field." Silence, and then to Daniel's relief, Liam let out a small giggle. Daniel swore it was the best sound he had ever heard. Claire watched them quietly, her expression softer than before. "Come on, Liam," she said. "Let's go for a walk." Daniel fell into step beside them as they wandered toward the playground. At first, Liam stayed close to Claire, but as the minutes passed, he started asking questions. "Where do you live?" "In the city," Daniel answered. "And is it fun?" "I guess that depends on what you think is fun." Liam thought for a moment. "Do you have a dog?" Daniel blinked. "No." Liam frowned. "Then it's not fun." Claire smirked, but Daniel was too focused on Liam's expression. "I could get a dog," he said. "Would that make it fun?" Liam's face lit up. "Yeah." Daniel chuckled, but before he could respond, Liam took off toward the swings. Claire let out a breath, crossing her arms. "That went better than I expected." Daniel nodded, watching Liam kick his legs as he swung higher. "He's incredible." Claire followed his gaze. "Yeah," she murmured. "He is." A comfortable silence stretched between them before Daniel spoke again. "Thank you," he said. Claire turned to him, surprised. "For what?" "For letting me be here, for giving me a chance." She sighed, looking down at her hands. "I don't know what this is yet, Daniel. I don't know if I trust you." He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "But I do know Liam deserves to know his father," she continued. "So, for now, we'll take it one step at a time." Daniel exhaled, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "That works for me." Because, for the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond his business, beyond his wealth. He had a son, and he wasn't going to waste another second. Section 5. Daniel had never been nervous before, not when signing billion-dollar deals, not when standing in front of investors, making decisions that could shift the market. But as he sat across from Claire in the quiet coffee shop after their trip to the park, he felt something he hadn't in years. Doubt, not in himself, but in whether Claire would ever let him back in. Liam had been a revelation. He was sharp, funny, and full of energy. Daniel had expected their first meeting to be awkward, maybe even tense, but his son had surprised him, and for the first time, Daniel felt like he belonged in a world that had been kept from him. But Claire, she was different. She sat across from him, stirring her tea, her expression unreadable. She had agreed to meet with him one-on-one after the park, but that didn't mean she trusted him. Far from it. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "I know this won't be easy, Claire." She let out a breath, looking away. "No, it won't. I want to be in Liam's life." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of her tea, setting it down carefully. "You say that now, but what happens when work takes over? When things get complicated?" "I don't care how complicated it gets," Daniel said, his voice firm. "He's my son. I won't walk away from him." Claire's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You already did." The words landed like a slap. Daniel clenched his jaw. "You think I would have left if I had known?" She shook her head, but there was sadness in her gaze. but I think you would have left eventually. Your job always came first, Daniel. I couldn't compete with that then, and I won't let Liam compete with it now." Daniel swallowed the sharp retort on his tongue. She had a point. Back then, he had prioritized everything except their marriage. He had been too busy proving himself, too caught up in becoming the kind of man his father had wanted him to be, and he had lost everything because of it. "I won't ask you to forgive me overnight," he said. "I just want the chance to show you that I've changed." Claire studied him, her expression wary. "And if I say no?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Then I'll fight for custody." Her face went still. Daniel exhaled. "I don't want to take him from you, Claire. You're an incredible mother, but I won't be a stranger in his life. That's not an option." A muscle flickered in her jaw. "And you think a judge would just give you that right, after being absent for 4 years? Daniel didn't flinch. "I have the means to prove I can provide for him. I have the resources, and if I have to go to court, I will." Claire's fingers curled around her cup. "So that's how this is going to go? Threats?" Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple. "No, Claire, that's not what I want." Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't say anything. "I just want time with him. That's it," he said. "I don't want to fight you. I don't want to make this harder than it has to be, but I won't disappear either." Claire looked down, her lips pressed together. For a long moment, the silence stretched between them. Then finally, she exhaled. "Okay," she said quietly. Daniel blinked. "Okay?" She met his gaze. "You can see him, but on my terms." Relief rushed through him, but he kept his voice even. "What are your terms?" Claire lifted her chin. "You don't disrupt his life. You don't come in making promises you can't keep. If you're serious about this, you'll take it slow." Daniel nodded. "Agreed." She studied him for another long moment. "I also don't want you introducing him to anyone else right now. No nannies, no assistants, just you." That was an easy promise to make. "Done." Claire hesitated, then let out a soft breath. "All right." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel left that coffee shop with more than just an agreement. He left with the first step towards something real. Over the next few weeks, Daniel saw Liam as often as Claire allowed. At first, it was just short visits. An hour at the park, a walk through the zoo. But as time passed, Liam began to warm up to him. He asked questions, laughed at Daniel's terrible jokes, and even started holding his hand when they crossed the street. Each moment felt like something sacred. And Daniel wasn't just playing a role. For the first time in his life, he was learning what it meant to be a father. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench eating ice cream, Liam turned to him with a serious expression. "Do you have a job?" he asked. Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, I do." Liam squinted. "Like Uncle Matt?" Daniel hesitated. "What does Uncle Matt do?" Claire's brother, Matt, was a middle school teacher. "He teaches kids math," Liam said proudly. Daniel smiled. "Well, I don't teach kids math, but I do run a company." Liam frowned. "That doesn't sound fun." Daniel laughed. "Some days it's not." Liam licked his ice cream cone, considering. "Do you like it?" Daniel hesitated. For so long, his job had defined him. It had been everything. But now it didn't feel as important as the little boy sitting beside him. "I used to," he admitted. "But lately I think I like spending time with you more." Liam grinned. "Then you should do that instead." Daniel chuckled. "Maybe I will." He meant it too. Work no longer felt like the center of his world. Liam did. And for the first time in his life, Daniel wanted to be more than just a CEO. He wanted to be a father. That night, Daniel sat in his office staring at his calendar. He had an upcoming business trip to London, one that had been planned months ago. But the thought of leaving for even a few days made his stomach twist. He didn't want to lose momentum with Liam. Didn't want to miss a single moment. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Mark, stepped in. "Sir, your travel itinerary for London is ready. You leave Friday." Daniel hesitated, then slowly he shook his head. "Cancel it." Mark blinked. "Sir, I'm not going," Daniel said. His assistant frowned. "But this deal, reschedule it." Mark hesitated but nodded. "Understood." Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling. For the first time in his career, he was putting something else first. And it felt right. Because no business deal in the world was worth more than the time he had left with his son. Section 6. Claire wasn't sure what to make of Daniel anymore. For weeks, she had expected him to lose interest. She thought he would get busy, miss a visit or two, and slowly fade away. But he hadn't. Instead, he had shown up again and again. He had canceled business trips, rearranged meetings, and made it clear that nothing, absolutely nothing, was more important to him than spending time with Liam. And Claire wasn't sure how to feel about it. She had spent years convincing herself that Daniel was incapable of change, that his workaholic tendencies were ingrained, and that nothing could ever break through the armor he had built around himself. But the man she saw now, he was different, and that scared her. Because if he was different, if he was truly changing, then she had to confront something she had buried deep, the part of her that had never really stopped loving him. One evening, Claire sat in the living room, flipping through a book while Liam played with his toy cars on the floor. Daniel was coming over soon. It had become a routine. He would stop by, have dinner with Liam, and spend some time with him before bedtime. It was so easy, so effortless, and that was the problem. Claire had spent so long building walls around her heart, but Daniel was slipping through the cracks. She was still cautious, still guarded, but it was getting harder to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at her, or the way Liam's face lit up every time his father walked through the door. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall for him again, but what if she already was? A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before opening it. Daniel stood there holding a pizza box in one hand and a small toy in the other. "For Liam," he said, handing her the toy first. Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're spoiling him." Daniel shrugged. "I missed him." And just like that, Claire's heart softened. She stepped aside, letting him in. Liam, hearing his father's voice, ran over with excitement. "Dad!" Daniel grinned, kneeling to his level. "Hey, buddy, I got you something." Liam's eyes widened as he unwrapped the toy, a small astronaut figurine. "Cool," Liam beamed. "It looks like the one in my book." Daniel ruffled his hair. "I remembered you liked it." Claire watched the exchange, something warm curling in her chest. Daniel wasn't just playing the part of a father, he was being one. And that terrified her, because it meant he was no longer the man she had walked away from. He was becoming someone new. And that meant she had a choice to make. Did she let him in, or did she keep running? Dinner was surprisingly easy. They ate together, laughing at Liam's stories about school and his new favorite show. For a moment, it felt normal, like they were a family again. After dinner, Liam dragged Daniel to his room to show him his drawings. Claire stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as she listened to their voices from down the hall. She had dreamed of moments like this, of a life where Daniel had been there from the beginning, and now that it was happening, she didn't know what to do with it. A few minutes later, Daniel returned to the kitchen, his expression thoughtful. "He's amazing," he said softly. Claire nodded. "He is." Daniel hesitated, then met her gaze. "Can we talk?" Claire's stomach tightened. "About what?" Daniel exhaled. "About us." She should have expected this, but she wasn't ready. "There is no us," she said, folding her arms. Daniel took a step closer. "There could be." Claire shook her head. "You don't get to say that now, not after everything." "I know," Daniel said, "but I can't pretend I don't want to try." Claire swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he had changed, but trusting him again, that was something else entirely. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. Daniel's gaze softened. "I get that, but I'm not asking you to decide tonight. Just let me prove it to you." Claire looked away. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Then let me prove it to Liam," Daniel said. "Let me show him that I'm not going anywhere, that I'm going to be here no matter what." Claire exhaled, her heart aching. She had spent years dreaming of this moment, but now that it was here, she didn't know if she could handle it, because if she let him in again, and he broke her heart a second time, she wasn't sure she would survive it. Section 7. Claire couldn't sleep that night. Daniel's words kept replaying in her mind. "Then let me prove it to Liam. Let me show him that I'm not going anywhere." It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything she had feared for years. She had spent so long convincing herself that she and Liam didn't need Daniel, that they were fine on their own. But now she wasn't so sure, because Daniel was showing up. He was proving day after day that he wanted to be a father, and that was dangerous, because if she let herself believe in him again, and he let them down, she wasn't sure how to pick up the pieces a second time. The next morning, Claire took Liam to the park. It was their weekend tradition, something just for the two of them. But when they arrived, she saw someone waiting near the benches. "Daniel." He was standing there, hands in his pockets, watching them with an unreadable expression. Claire's first instinct was irritation. She hadn't invited him. But before she could say anything, Liam spotted him. "Dad!" And just like that, he was off, running straight into Daniel's arms. Claire watched as Daniel scooped him up effortlessly, spinning him around before setting him down with a laugh. He looked happy. Liam looked happy. And that did something to her, something she wasn't ready to admit. Claire crossed her arms, walking over. "What are you doing here?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Daniel gave her a small smile. "Liam mentioned you come here on Saturdays. I thought I'd come too." Claire narrowed her eyes. "You thought?" Daniel sighed. "I wanted to see him and I wanted to see you." Liam, oblivious to the tension between them, tugged on Daniel's hand. "Come play with me." Daniel chuckled. "All right, buddy, what are we playing?" Liam grinned. "Tag, you're it." Before Daniel could react, Liam darted off, giggling. Daniel turned back to Claire, hesitating. "Is this okay?" he asked. Claire wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to leave, to let her and Liam have their space. But when she looked at her son, so full of joy, she couldn't bring herself to do it. She sighed. "Just don't let him win too easily," she muttered. Daniel's smile widened. "Noted." And then he took off after Liam, laughter filling the air. Claire watched them, arms still crossed, heart still guarded. But deep down she knew something had shifted, and she wasn't sure she could stop it. For the next few weeks, Daniel became a presence in their lives. Not just in the scheduled visits or the moments Claire expected him, but in the small things. The casual texts checking in, the surprise coffee he'd bring when he knew she had a long day, the way he listened when Liam talked about school, or his favorite cartoons. He was integrating himself into their world in a way Claire hadn't anticipated, and it was messing with her. She told herself she was just tolerating it for Liam's sake, that it didn't mean anything, that she wasn't letting him back in. But one evening after dinner, she found herself standing in the kitchen, watching Daniel help Liam put together a puzzle, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if he really had changed? What if he could be the father Liam needed? What if there was still something left between them? She shook the thoughts away. She couldn't think like that, because it didn't change the past. It didn't change the nights she had spent alone, pregnant, wondering if Daniel even cared. It didn't change the hurt, but even as she tried to remind herself of that, her heart wasn't listening. That night, after Liam was asleep, Daniel lingered in the doorway. "Thanks for letting me stay longer," he said. Claire nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Liam likes having you here." Daniel hesitated. "And you?" Claire's breath caught. She looked up, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "I don't know." Daniel studied her, his expression unreadable. "I meant what I said before," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Claire swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can believe that," she admitted. Daniel took a step closer. "I'll prove it to you," he said, "even if it takes the rest of my life." Claire's heart ached, because she wanted to believe him, but she had believed him once before, and that had nearly broken her. So she did the only thing she could. She took a step back and she whispered, "Good night, Daniel." Daniel's face flickered with something, maybe disappointment, maybe understanding, but he didn't push, he just nodded. "Good night, Claire," and then he left, leaving Claire standing there, heart pounding, walls trembling, and wondering if she had just made a mistake. Section 8. Claire barely slept that night. No matter how many times she turned over, adjusted her pillow, or tried to empty her mind, one thought remained: Daniel. His words, his persistence, and his promises. She had spent years building a life without him, convincing herself that she and Liam were better off alone, that they didn't need him. But now, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if that was true, and that terrified her. Because the risk wasn't just about her anymore, it was about Liam. She had fought so hard to protect her son from heartbreak, and if she let Daniel back in, if she gave him another chance, what if he disappointed them again? What if she let her guard down only to watch him walk away for a second time? Claire let out a frustrated sigh, sitting up in bed. She couldn't do this. She couldn't let herself hope. Not yet. The next morning, Claire took Liam to school as usual, but when she pulled into the driveway afterward, she wasn't alone. Daniel's car was parked outside. He was leaning against it, waiting for her. Claire sighed, gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't in the mood for another confrontation, but she couldn't exactly ignore him. Steeling herself, she got out of the car and walked over. "What are you doing here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Daniel smiled, but there was something hesitant about it. "I wanted to talk," he said. Claire arched a brow. "We did talk last night." "I know," he admitted, "but I need you to hear me out." Claire hesitated. She should tell him to leave, should tell him that there was nothing more to say, but instead she sighed and gestured toward the house. "Fine, come in." Daniel followed her inside, his presence filling the space in a way that felt both familiar and foreign. She led him to the kitchen, where she busied herself making coffee, mostly to avoid looking at him. "So," she said finally, setting down a mug in front of him. "Talk." Daniel took a deep breath. "I know I hurt you," he said, voice steady. "I know I let you down in ways I can't take back. But Claire, I'm trying. I'm really trying." Claire said nothing. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," he continued, "but I need you to know that I won't walk away again. Not from Liam, and not from you." Claire clenched her jaw. "That's easy to say," she murmured. Daniel leaned forward. "Then let me prove it." Claire's stomach twisted, because that was the problem. He was proving it. Little by little, and it was breaking down every wall she had built. She shook her head. "I don't know if I can risk it," she admitted. Daniel's eyes softened. "Then don't risk it for me," he said. "Risk it for Liam." That hit harder than Claire expected, because she knew how much her son adored his father, how much he wanted him in his life. Could she really be the one standing in the way of that? Could she let her own fear keep Liam from having the father he deserved? She swallowed hard. "I need time," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Take all the time you need." And for the first time, Claire almost believed him. As the days passed, Claire found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Daniel was there, not just for the big moments, but for the small ones too. He picked Liam up from school when she had to work late. He helped with bedtime stories. He even started showing up at soccer practice, cheering Liam on from the sidelines. He was present, and that was something Claire had never expected. But it also made things more complicated, because the more she saw him step up, the harder it became to keep her heart closed. One evening, as she sat in the living room folding laundry, she heard laughter coming from Liam's bedroom. She glanced up. Daniel was sitting on the floor with Liam, helping him build a Lego set. Liam's face was full of joy, and Daniel's, it was the same. Not forced, not obligatory, just genuine. Claire's chest tightened, because this was what she had always wanted. A family, a partner, someone to share the good and the bad. And yet, could she trust him again? Could she let herself believe that this time was different? She exhaled, forcing herself to look away. She wasn't ready, not yet, but she was beginning to wonder, what if? What if Daniel really had changed? What if she wasn't just protecting Liam from heartbreak, but protecting herself from something that might actually be real? She didn't have an answer, but as she watched them together, one thought lingered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late after all. Section 9. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, her mind a battlefield of emotions she couldn't quite sort through. The past few weeks had been filled with something she hadn't expected. Peace. Daniel had kept his word. He hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded anything from her. He had simply been there, present, steady, reliable, exactly the way she had always wanted him to be. And Liam? Liam was thriving. Every time Daniel showed up at soccer practice, every time he sat down to help with homework or tucked him in at night, Liam's face lit up in a way Claire hadn't seen in years. It was becoming normal, which scared Claire more than she wanted to admit. Because what happened if this was temporary? What happened if one day Daniel decided that he couldn't do this after all? What if he got bored? What if he left again? The thought made her stomach twist. She couldn't do that to Liam, she wouldn't. But deep down, she also knew something else. She was afraid of more than just Daniel failing their son. She was afraid of him failing her, of what it would mean if she let herself believe in him again, only to be shattered in the end. She had spent years convincing herself that she was done with Daniel Gray, that she had moved on. But now, as she watched him become the man she had always hoped he would be, she wasn't so sure anymore. And that terrified her. Later that evening, Claire stood in the doorway of Liam's room, watching as he sleepily curled against Daniel's side. They had been reading a bedtime story, but now Liam's little fingers were wrapped around the fabric of Daniel's shirt, his breathing slow and even. Daniel didn't move, didn't try to shift Liam off of him or wake him up. Instead, he just sat there, resting a protective hand over his son's back. Claire's chest tightened, because for the first time she believed him. Daniel wasn't pretending to care about their son. He loved him. And Liam, he needed his father. Claire swallowed hard before stepping into the room. "You can put him in bed," she murmured. Daniel looked up, a soft smile on his face. "I don't mind staying a little longer," he admitted. Claire hesitated, and then, before she could stop herself, she said, "Stay for dinner." Daniel blinked in surprise. "You sure?" Claire nodded. I think it's time we actually talk." Dinner was surprisingly easy. They sat across from each other, plates of pasta between them, and for the first time in years the conversation flowed. No arguments, no cold silences, no tension thick enough to suffocate them. It was nice, comfortable even. Daniel asked about her job. Claire asked about his latest business ventures. They laughed, really laughed, at a story Liam had told earlier about a school project gone wrong. It felt natural, like slipping into an old rhythm neither of them had realized they missed. And then, as they were finishing up, Daniel set his fork down and met Claire's gaze. "Do you think we could ever try again?" he asked, his voice steady but quiet. Claire's breath hitched. She wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that this them was still possible, but she was scared. "Daniel," she sighed. He leaned forward, his expression gentle. "I'm not asking you to jump into anything," he said. I need to know if there's still a chance." Claire hesitated. Then finally she whispered, "I don't know." She expected disappointment, expected him to pull back, but instead Daniel nodded. "Then I'll wait," he said simply. And for the first time, Claire wondered if maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to keep running anymore. The following weekend, Daniel invited them to a small family gathering at his mother's house. Claire almost declined. It felt too soon, too much like stepping into old territory she wasn't sure she belonged in anymore. But Liam's excitement changed her mind. He wanted to go, wanted to spend time with his father's side of the family. And Claire? She realized she wanted to see them again too. So, with a deep breath, she agreed. The moment they stepped inside, Claire was hit with the warm familiarity of the Gray household. It smelled like home-cooked meals and fresh flowers, like childhood memories and the safety of the past. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, pulled Claire into a tight hug the moment she saw her. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. "It's so good to see you again." Claire's throat tightened. She had missed this, missed the way Eleanor always made her feel like family, even when things between her and Daniel had fallen apart. "Thank you for having us," Claire said softly. Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "You're always welcome here," she said firmly. The words settled deep in Claire's heart, because for the first time in a long time she felt like she belonged. Like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had convinced herself she was. Daniel caught her gaze from across the room. He didn't say anything, didn't push, but the look in his eyes said it all. He was waiting, waiting for her to see what he was offering, waiting for her to realize that maybe, just maybe, she wanted to take it. For the first time since she handed him those divorce papers, Claire allowed herself to wonder, was there still hope for them after all? Section 10. Claire stood on the balcony of Daniel's mother's house, the autumn air crisp against her skin. Inside, the warm hum of conversation and laughter filled the space, the sounds of a family that had always embraced her. She had expected to feel like an outsider. Instead, she felt home. Liam was inside, sitting on the floor with his cousins, absorbed in a board game. Eleanor was chatting with Daniel's sister, occasionally glancing over at Claire with a knowing smile. And Daniel, he had been watching her all night, not hovering, not pressuring, just waiting like he had promised. Claire exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the chilly night air. She had spent so long convincing herself that her marriage to Daniel was unsalvageable, that the hurt was too deep, the damage too severe. But the truth was, Daniel had changed. He had proven himself, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. And Claire, she had changed too. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away all those years ago. She was stronger now, more certain of what she deserved. And maybe Daniel had finally become the man who could give her that. "You okay?" His voice was soft as he stepped onto the balcony beside her. Claire turned to him, her heart hammering in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think I'm still trying to figure that out." Daniel nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "I get it," he said, "and I don't want to rush you, but Claire..." He hesitated, then continued, "I love you. I always have. Claire's breath hitched. It wasn't the first time he had said those words, but it was the first time she believed them. Because now they weren't just words, they were backed by actions, by time, by change. She turned to face him fully. "And if I'm not ready?" she asked, testing him. Daniel gave her a small, lopsided smile. "Then I wait." Claire swallowed, emotion rising in her throat. It would be so easy to say yes, to step back into the warmth of what they once had. But she couldn't. Not yet. "I need more time," she whispered. Daniel reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "Then take all the time you need," he said. "Just don't shut me out completely." Claire squeezed his fingers, the first real sign of hope she had given him. "I won't," she promised, and for the first time she meant it. The following weeks were filled with something Claire never thought she'd have again: possibility. Daniel didn't press. He didn't try to rush her into a decision. Instead, he just kept showing up. Every morning he called to check on her and Liam. Every evening he made sure to spend time with their son, never missing a single soccer practice or bedtime story. And Claire? She found herself looking forward to those moments more than she wanted to admit, because slowly, piece by piece, Daniel was earning back her trust. Until one night something changed. Liam had fallen asleep early, and Claire found herself sitting in the living room with Daniel, an old movie playing in the background. They weren't touching. They weren't even talking, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Finally, Daniel turned to her, his gaze searching. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Are you still in love with me?" Claire's heart pounded. She could lie, could pretend that she was still unsure, but she was sure. She had been for a while now. Slowly, she reached for his hand. "Yes," she whispered. Daniel exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath for weeks. But then, to her surprise, he didn't pull her into a desperate kiss. He didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he just laced their fingers together and whispered, "Then let me prove to you that I'll never break your heart again." And in that moment, Claire knew. She was finally ready to believe him. A few months later, Claire stood at the altar, her fingers wrapped tightly around Daniel's. It was a small ceremony, no extravagant decorations, no hundreds of guests, just close family and friends. Because this time it wasn't about the grand gestures, it was about them. As the officiant spoke, Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion. She had never thought she would be standing here again, had never imagined that she would give Daniel a second chance. But as she looked into his eyes, she knew. This was right, this was home. "I do," she whispered, sealing their promise. Daniel grinned, his own eyes shining with emotion. "I do." And as he kissed her, Claire finally let go of the past. Because this was their new beginning, one built on trust, on forgiveness, and on a love that, despite everything, had never truly died. The end. If you love this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming emotional tales. Emotional tales.